This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-host, Dalia Shendlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like and find fascinating. Now, if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you.
And today we're very pleased to welcome David Rieff. He's a political analyst, a journalist, a cultural critic, and the author of 9 books. He is a member of the New York Institute for the Humanities, collaborated as an editor on the World Policy Journal, The New Republic, and Harper's Magazine, and published in pretty much every important outlet, I would say, in the world. He's held many other affiliations, and today we'll be discussing his 2016 book, In Praise of Forgetting, Historical Memory and Its Ironies, published by Yale University Press. Speaking to us from Dublin today. David, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
As I read your book, it could have also been titled In Praise of Forgetting in Defense of History. You argue for why too much historic, collective, and perhaps selective memory can be a bad thing, but it seems like you keep up a running defense in a way of historical research and accuracy. Can you try to characterize the difference between memory, as you analyze it here in this context, and history in the context of your book?
Sure. I think when the history that I praise, to the extent I praise anything in that rather morose book, is critical history. That is to say, history that is not trying to buttress a current political opinion or tendency or politics of any kind. And that, is not the only definition of history, but it's the one that I counterpose to historical memory, sometimes called collective memory, which is basically an attempt to mobilize the past, either in defense of something in the present or of something one wishes to happen, or as a way of denouncing something that exists today. And, history, to me, the value of history is that it makes things more complicated, not that it simplifies things. And collective memory is by definition an act of simplification. It's an act of political mobilization. It's an act of collective mourning. It's many different things, but it's not history, at least in this fairly narrow sense that I've defined it. And that's the opposition.
So I'd like to ask you about the overlap between history and memory, maybe between fact and memory, because on the one hand, the great improvement in historiography and historical research has led, ironically, to the decline of history as a social force. And I'd like to know whether you think that history, or maybe fact, and memory sometimes compete, or do they serve totally distinctive purposes separately from each other?
Well, first of all, I think that, of course, they compete in the sense that history, as it were, for history's sake, or to get the past right, is different than history for the present's sake or posterity's sake. I mean, obviously, these are not airtight categories. These are not, they bleed into each other, to mix my metaphors horribly. So, I mean, you can't say there's quiddity 1 and quiddity 2, as it were. But what you can say is that I think the purposes are somewhat different. I mean, critical history basically is founded on the idea, to quote the first line of a famous English novel, The Go-Between, L.P. Hartley's novel, The Past is Another Country, They Do Things Differently There. Collective memory is about, as it were, saying the past is relevant to the present can only be understood, thinking about the past the scars, wounds, memories, whatever, of the past must somehow be dealt with, et cetera, et cetera. And there you start, I think, falling into, well, ideas about political mobilization, about collective mourning, but also about just saying that you can pick and choose the past. The past becomes a kind of menu, if you like, that you can have the tasting plate, or you can have one dish that you're particularly fond of, or whatever. So, I mean, again, these things are not total opposites, but they're certainly used for different purposes. And collective memory, in particular, I mean, in the sense by which I mean when I talk about collective historical memory, is, of course, in neurological terms, a complete fiction. There's no such thing as collective memory. There's individual memory. But what there is obviously the collectively agreed upon narrative of nations, ethnic groups, religions, you name it, families for that matter. And those are very powerful things. But I would insist that memory is something of a misnomer in that context.
Well, one of the most common prevailing attitudes, it seems to me, in the post-war era is Santayana's, of course, famous adage that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And it seems so ingrained in our way of thinking. To me, it seems almost self-evident. But you, of course, cite the tragic, ironic quip that those who remember history are also condemned to repeat it. So what's the danger here in remembering history? Is there any causal link between remembering history and doing terrible things and committing atrocities?
No, I don't think so. There was a man called Nicholas Winton who, a few years ago, I think I mentioned him in the book. He was an Englishman. I'm not quite sure the context for his action, whether it was through a group or something he organized himself. Anyway, he rescued a lot of Jewish children in the 1930s and managed to bring them to the UK. And he, very late in his life, this would have only been 6 or 7 years ago, he lived to 100 and something. He did a hard talk interview, that famous sort of rigorous program. And to the stupefaction of the presenter, Winton said, "Well, I don't think you learned much from the past." Because, of course, the interviewer wanted to know, well, what are the lessons for today, and et cetera, from, what we should have learned from the Nazi era, et cetera. And I'm with Winton. I actually think what Santayana said may be the stupidest thing ever said by a smart person that I'm familiar with, because I think it's palpably false. I don't think the memory of the Shoah has stopped a single genocide, no matter how widely publicized. I think events take their own course. Histories are not transferable. Lessons are not transferable. I mean, if you're, and so, I once wrote when I worked in Bosnia during the war there, and in none of my books are exactly cheerful, but in my book on the Bosnian War is particularly grim, even by my generous standards. And I said that I thought that the phrase "never again" meant simply that never again would Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. And I pretty much stick by that. I don't think the past is any kind of prophylactic against some horror in the present. And I simply see no evidence for that. If I did, I'd change my mind, in Keynes's famous remark. But I don't see any evidence for it. So, when Santayana says those who, fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it, I sort of wonder what he's talking about. It just doesn't seem right to me. Now, that doesn't mean that structures that we inherit from the past should go unopposed or unchallenged. I mean, for example, coming back to something that's, been happening in the United States in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which has been a systematic and, so far at least, largely successful effort to take down most of the statuary to the Confederates that has been all over the southern part of the United States, all over the old Confederacy, but also in other places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. I mean, that seems to me that reckoning with these objects, thinking about the past and trying to change the way the past is memorialized seems to me absolutely fine. And I don't want to get into some kind of, stupid extremism. It's my book is basically an argument for the following idea, which is that, sure, if all things are equal, let's by all means remember the past. And but all things sometimes aren't equal.
Usually.
And so, probably usually, but let's just say there are historical situations where memory is not healing, is not instructive, it's damaging, it provokes more war, for example. I mean, the classic example I use is Northern Ireland. There's nobody won or lost in Northern Ireland. There was never any question of imposing a narrative the way, say, the occupying powers in Germany after 1945 could impose, a pedagogy, if you will. That can't happen in Northern Ireland because it was a stalemate at the end. So it's much better, it seems to me, for peace in Northern Ireland, even if it's to some extent unjust. And we could certainly talk about, how, what a just and unjust peace is and how we think about those two possibilities morally. But, in Ireland, it's better that just the period of the Troubles, as they call it, the sort of low-grade, irregular war that took place in the province for 30 years, just be glossed over, and everybody, both communities, agree to have their own version. And I think in that case, that's common sense morality and also prudentially the correct thing to do. There are other times when memory might, getting the thing right might be okay. I mean, you could argue that in the Balkans, you may have gotten to a point where what really happened in Bosnia doesn't have to be, as it were, both sides' versions don't have to be honored in practical terms. And another example is Spain. When Franco's dictatorship was overthrown, or it ended, or his successor's reign ended, the Democratic parties, right and left, agreed to what was called the Pact of Forgetting. And they basically agreed that what had happened in the Civil War would simply not be talked about in institutional terms. Mass graves would not be dug up, et cetera, et cetera. And it seemed at the time as if that were a sine qua non of the democratic transition. But, today, it seems, in Spain, people no longer feel the need for that. They're tired of their pact of forgetting. They want to remember. And that seems equally legitimate to me. I don't think any of these things should be eternal. I mean, ideas of this kind are mortal, just like people, just like civilizations. So there's no, I don't want to do the opposite, which is, counter Santayana with, as it were, my own idiocy, to wit, that, those who are unwilling to forget are doomed to screw up in the future, or whatever modern vernacular version of his elegant phrasing I might use.
So what really is the purpose of studying history, do you think? Is it just an intellectual, academic exercise? I mean, most people think that it has a social role to play. And in a sense, what you're saying is leave history aside.
Yeah, I don't think history has a tremendous social role to play. It seems to me, I try to think of where it's played a positive role. I can give you now, if what you were saying is history is useful for political mobilization, well, of course. I mean, the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz wrote one of his poems. He says, "It's possible there's no other memory but the memory of wounds." And God knows history is good for, if what you want is to remember your wounds collectively or individually. History is very useful for that. But is it useful socially? I wouldn't have thought so. Maybe I'm missing side. Maybe, I didn't go to class that day, but I don't quite understand why that is.
Maybe I can pick up on something that you yourself said, which is that history does lend a lot of complexity to understanding the past, as opposed to collective memory, which tends to simplify. And my question then, building on what Gilad asked maybe, is maybe history has a role, the true historic search for the truth, in adding complexity to our perspectives, which combats a simplistic notion of who we are, identity-wise, or in terms of nationalist narratives. Could that be a role?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
One can dream. But in your experience, that's not what's happened.
That seems to be positively utopian. I can't think of a single instance of that in actual, it seems to me that the history people want to learn is either the history of their glory or the history of their victimization, one or the other. And both of them seem to have produced quite appalling results, and I suppose will continue to do so. Nobody likes complexity. It's hard. Whereas, Nietzsche said that, what's some philosophical text next to an organ grinder and a patriotic tune? It's consoling. It makes you angry, makes you sad, makes you proud, makes you feel better than other people, makes you feel other people need to be taken down a peg because they were so mean to your ancestors, whatever. God loved complex, nuanced history that acknowledges that the past is another country. But in terms of that being I don't think that's going to be, I think there are probably more people interested in Sanskrit than in that.
Than in complexity. Can I ask you about where did the idea for this book germinate? Did you have this notion before you were covering the wars in Bosnia and the Balkans in general and in Rwanda?
No, it came from the Balkans. It came actually, I'm not sure if I tell this story, and I think I do, but it looks old and I'm working on other things now. But I was in Belgrade during the Bosnian War. I was mostly in Sarajevo and in the Bosnian North. But I went to Belgrade, to Serbia a bunch of times. And in 93, I think it was, I was there and I was interviewing people. I went to see this fellow called Vuk Draskovic, who's still alive. He was a nationalist leader, but anti-government, and therefore something of a dissident in the context of the time, but very much a Serb nationalist. And so I went to have an interview with him. Reasonable guy, interesting interview. But as I was leaving, one of his aides, as he was seeing me out to the street to get the cab, he gave me a folded up piece of paper and said, read this in the cab. So I got in the cab and I opened it up and it said 1453. That's all it said. And of course, what it meant was clear enough. It meant it was a reference to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, which was, meant Serbia was again protecting Christendom from the Muslim onslaught, which was the feature of Serb nationalist propaganda during the war. You'd see these posters with a map of Europe with a kind of green stain beginning to cover it all. And, so I thought, oh, well, actually, historical memory, which I had thought of in, I think, fairly conventional, sort of nice liberal terms, nice in scare quotes, was maybe not always right. And again, there are moments when memory, I think, probably can be helpful. I don't want to make some general rule.
Well, you do tell the story in the book, and the only surprise that I had was that it didn't say 1389 on that ticket.
Yeah, they wanted something even bigger.
There's something bigger than 1389 in the Balkans.
I'm sure just, I mean, Kosovo, Polia was as nothing compared to the fall of Rome, or the new Rome. But yeah, he could have written 1389 just as easily. I mean, the fact that, but again, the Battle of Kosovo, 1389, is a great example. There were as many Serb Christians fighting on the Ottoman side as fighting for the Kingdom of Serbia or whatever it was in 1389. It was like many medieval battles. People changed sides all the time. People fought for money. An example which hasn't had the same kind of noxious effect, which I cite in the book, is Scotland. Is William Wallace, portrayed so picturesquely by Mr. Gibson in Braveheart, which, is quite a comic film. If you know anything about medieval Northern Europe, you sort of wait to the next howler, which comes about reliably every 5 minutes or so. There were Scots. They were. These weren't nationalisms in the mid 19th to mid 20th century sense. You fought depending on where your lands were, what you thought your advantage was, and it was completely fluid. But of course, Kosovo, and so when in Scotland, again, it doesn't do anyone any harm. No one's going to get killed over. I mean, more people can get killed in Scotland over, a football riot. They're not going to get killed over an argument about William Wallace. But it's totally inaccurate, and yet the Scottish National Party, which is now the governing party of the province, treats what happened as a kind of, nationalist historical fact. And you see the same in Catalonia. I spent a fair bit of time in Spain, and Catalan nationalism all depends on at some point they're all going to raise the question of whether in 1714 bringing Catalonia into the Kingdom of Spain was illegal, and therefore Catalonia is independent. I mean, this is the stuff of nationalisms all over the world, and again, sometimes it's harmless, and sometimes it's as in the case of Scotland, and sometimes it costs a lot of people their lives and the rest, like as in Bosnia.
I'd like to ask you now to qualify perhaps on the distance of the historical events. If you look at Israel or maybe the Jews, we are equally traumatized by two events. One is very recent, the Holocaust, within the living memory of some people still, and the other is the destruction of the temple that goes back millennia. And, all these other events in early modernity and the late medieval period that you mentioned now are somewhere in between. Do you think that it plays a role where on the timeline the event took place?
Well, let me start by, saying the most, probably, the toughest thing I'm going to say in real terms, which is that everything's going to get forgotten, including by the Jews, who are the paradigmatic or emblematic people of memory, in the sense that I don't know of any other people, certainly no other religion where memory is so central. I mean, obviously, half the historians of Judaism who've ever written have said this. So it's such a truism. Maybe it's not even completely true. What do I know? I'm no expert. But it seems to me that the first thing you have to say is that no memory is going to last, even for very, very ancient peoples like the Jews, with a continuous, as it were, corporate or collective identity. I mean, they're at some points, the temple will be forgotten, and the Shoah will be forgotten. I mean, I don't think that's debatable. 10,000 years from now, people are not going to be thinking about what happened in between 1941 and 1945, and certainly not what happened I don't remember when the temple was destroyed.
70 AD.
And, 70 in the Common Era. Then, well, are people going to remember that? I doubt it. I mean, already lots of things are forgotten, things that were very, very important historically to people, including, I think, I mean, is the wound that Sabbatai Tzvi caused in Eastern European Judaism when he converted to Islam, is that something that still traumatizes Jews in 2021? I suppose you could find somebody somewhere, but I doubt it.
We have other traumas to worry about. But can I challenge you?
Plenty of modern trauma.
Yeah. Can I challenge you a little bit on this? Because I think that, first of all, I do think in popular memory, the concept of memory is important. Just look at Quebecois license plates that say "Je me souviens" or "Remember the Alamo" for that matter. These things are part of national identity, not only among Jews. And even more so, you give a couple of examples. I mean, specifically thinking about the Holocaust, I think Holocaust scholars have noted, and I think as an Israeli political analyst, I note that the centrality of the Holocaust in Israeli understandings and the desire for it to be so central in Jewish life, including the Pew survey from 2013 of American Jews, which I believe you cite, showing how important it is for identity, seems to be getting even stronger as the last of the survivors die. And the other example, which you also cite, is the Armenians who, as Hitler pointed out, with proximity, there wasn't great attention paid to what happened just a few decades earlier. But look at the Armenian diaspora now and how deeply, deeply focused they are on the memory of the genocide. Could it be that the opposite is also true, that as time passes, the memories of trauma loom even larger in the national identity?
Well, I can't speak. I mean, I know a bit about the Armenian case, and I used to have reason to be in Armenia itself. I know less about the diaspora in Paris and in California and in Massachusetts, but I do know something about it. But I can tell you that I think these are, in the case of American Jews, which I think I've sort of observed more closely and feel more confident in speaking about. The identity, the Shoah is one of the few things that binds them together nowadays. I think it's as much a lifeboat as it, a psychic and historic, lifeboat as it is some, great psychological process in the other senses, including the one you described. Jews are, except for Orthodox Jews who don't need the Shoah to know their own, to feel Jewish. Feel in quotation marks. You know more about this than I do, I'm sure. But rates of intermarriage among younger Jews without conversion of the other member of the couple through the roof. Religious attendance down, culinary laws largely abandoned. You don't have much left. Then you're in the sense that Czesław Miłosz meant it. Your memory of this great wound, is that really going to last? Yeah. Now absolutely true. In the Armenian case, Turkish denialism is, I think, what basically fuels, Armenian cohesion.
Definitely, I agree with that.
It's, if tomorrow, I would come from the ghastly Erdogan, but if if a decent government ever comes to Ankara, don't expect to live to see it, but I suppose it'll happen someday, and acknowledged the crimes of the Turkish state in 1915-16, I think I think it would start to wane in the Armenian diaspora, as Abdullah just. I think that's what makes it so alive, is this constant affront of Turkish refusal to acknowledge what happened.
The book was published in 2016 and written just on the eve of the Trump presidency. And you deal a lot with it, as we just heard, with the shaping of the past, and even to a lesser extent with the shaping of the future in our collective memory and imagination. But it seems now, reading it now in 2021, it seems like it was written during a proverbial age of innocence, when the present was not contested to the same extent that it is today, with fake news and all that jazz. Do you think that the years that have passed since its publication have contributed to the shaping of the present in the same way that the history and the past is being shaped in your analysis?
Well, listen, you're never a good reader of your own work, and it's a fool's errand to pretend to be one. So you write these things. They have the life they have. If they're any good at all, they'll be read after you're dead, which means you'll have literally no possibility of influencing how they're read. So you might as well start while you're alive.
No, but do you think that it raised some questions about the shaping of the present as well?
I don't think so. No? Look, first of all, the one thing I did get right about the current year in the book is there's a long section denouncing the Confederate statues. And that was a long time before anyone except African Americans cared about this. I'm sure there were exceptions, but the only community that was really, and they were largely unsuccessful and might have remained unsuccessful had it not been, well, first for the mass shooting in Charleston, the Dylan Roof, the mass murder of these people in a black church, and then of course the George Floyd thing and BLM and all that followed. And I have very mixed feelings about BLM, but that part is 127% positive as far as I'm concerned. The statues had no business being there in the first place. And I have no problem, by the way, in the European equivalent, when the demonstrators tossed the statue of Edward Colston into the river in Bristol. I thought, I know Bristol a bit, I thought at last about time. I did get that part, I think, right in terms of the relevancy to 2021 or to the Trump era and the post-Trump era, assuming it lasts. I don't think it's out of the question that Trump or Trump light returns, but that's probably another conversation for another day. Fake news. The internet has turned out to be the kind of talk radio of the psyche. Wasn't what people thought it was going to be, but that is what it is. And it's a place for malice, venom, resentment, and madness, much more than anything else, as well as a lot of, pop stuff, adulation, the K-pop thing, for example. But I don't think fake news is the main thing. I think I think the most important thing that's happened is not fake news. It's that nobody wants to talk to anyone they disagree with, except to abuse them. And I think that's to me far more important than fake news. In any case, candidly, I never bought the idea that, Vladimir Putin's bots through the election to Donald Trump. It seemed to me that Donald Trump represented, Donald Trump is the American id, if you'll permit me to put it that way. And it's certainly no surprise that he got a lot of votes, whether, So I'm maybe I just don't understand how important fake news is. God knows that.
We have to finish up soon, so I'm just going to ask you a last pretty light, and simple question. I want to talk briefly about what you refer to quite a bit throughout the book as Avishai Margalit's concept of moral collective memory, but I'm going to violently oversimplify it for the sake of the question, as, proposing that there can be some sort of universal moral understanding of what we should remember. And you write in Critique that history is not a menu and that we can't have the collective solace of some sort of shared national memory without fear and self-absorption that goes along with it. In terms of national identity and memory. So that made me ask myself about the reverse, which is, what if we tried to have a universal moral memory, as you want to, however you want to explain that, which I was simplifying to a sort of universal set of values, I guess, about the past. How could we have that without also losing the very culture, national identity, the distinctions, those very unique experiences and points of reference that make us different and human at the same time?
A light and cheerful question.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is light and cheerful. God, I await with trepidation the heavy and sorrowful one. Let me put it, if I can, in sort of two ways. The first is Avishai Margalit, for whom I have greatest respect. I mean, the two people I'm arguing with throughout the book are Avishai Margalit, whom I know very slightly, but have read very attentively, and Tzvetan Todorov, the Franco-Bulgarian philosopher and writer whom I knew extremely well and argued with very intensely in person as well as in my head. Both of whom think that I'm, completely wrong, but I would say they think that because fundamentally they're Kantian optimists. Avishai would wince at that, being called an optimist, I know, but still. But Kantians, anyway. Maybe I should remove the optimist part.
We can strike it from the record if you want.
Basically, to say there's a no. So yeah, I just bulldoze on and say any old nonsense. But they really believe that, as Kant did famously, and Kant's famous phrase, ought implies can. And to me, that's a blindingly utopian construct. And as my friend John Gray and I, like to say, the thing that unites his work, I'm a great fan and friend, and in some ways co-conspirator. If you looked at my work, which is very, it's lots of different things. I mean, I wrote a book about Cuban exiles once. I've written a lot about immigration one way or another. I wrote about wars. I've done a lot of different sort of things, but there is actually something that unites them all. And what unites them all is anti-utopianism. And in a sense, my book, this book, I mean, the Crazy Forgetting book, is, kind of, where I come out of the closet, if you will, fully and without, just, kind of confronting that theme or that argument that I wanted to make in many forms, explicitly and overtly. I don't think these things are possible. I mean, to me, this is all, it's like saying, it's like the people who wanted to have Esperanto, except people who wanted to have Esperanto were, for the most part, not the brightest bulbs in the box. Whereas, Avishai Margaret and Stefan Turro for, two of the smartest people who've thought about things in the last 100 years. So, and I fully recognize that and bow to it. But I still think, imagining this stuff is like imagining one of these days we're all going to speak Esperanto. Well, we're not.
David Rieff, thank you very much for joining us today and discussing your 2016 book, In Praise of Forgetting, Historical Memory and Its Ironies. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And also many thanks to Ariel Cohen, our producer, and Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please rate us. Write us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. You can look at our archive that has, I'd say, around 700 interviews to keep you entertained and hopefully annoyed as well. Like us on Facebook, follow me, Dalia, and the podcast on Twitter, and of course join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.